To view subtitles, please enable the custom subtitles specifically set for this video. Night falls on a medieval world gripped by pestilence. It is the middle of the 14th century, and an ominous shadow creeps across Europe. In towns and villages once full of life, silence has become the loudest sound. The Black Death has arrived, not as legend, but as lived reality. A creeping, invisible terror that has unmade families, emptied homes, and turned prayers into pleas. This is not a tale of gallant knights or mythical beasts. It is the story of ordinary people facing an extraordinary horror, a world where a cough can seal a fate, where hope is carried in herbs and whispered blessings, and where fear walks beside every man and woman as closely as their own shadow. And yet, even here, in the darkest corners of history, there is something quiet and powerful. A stillness, a flickering candle in the window, a melody in the night air. These are the moments we explore together. If calm, immersive storytelling brings you peace, feel free to like the video and subscribe. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's strangely comforting to see how far these voices echo and who they reach in the quiet hours. So dim the lights. Let the sounds around you fade, and join me now as we walk by lantern glow into the plague-shadowed past. In the year 1347, rumours travel along merchant routes of a strange sickness in far-off lands. By 1348, those whispers have turned to screams and prayers as a mysterious plague engulfs town after town. This era will later be known as the Black Death, but to those living through it, it is simply the Great Mortality, an incomprehensible catastrophe, a waking nightmare. Picture a bustling market square in Florence on a bright spring morning of 1348. Stall owners call out prices of bread and fruit, children chase one another around the fountain, and life carries on much as it has for generations. Now imagine that same piazza weeks later, silent and nearly deserted at noon. The fountain trickles unattended, shutters of houses hang open, but no faces peer out. A cold wind drifts through alleyways that once overflowed with life, carrying the faint toll of a church bell in the distance. The bell has been ringing non-stop for days, each peal marking another soul's passing. A few dark figures move like shadows along the edges of the square, carts rolling behind them laden with shrouded shapes. They're collecting the dead. This is the age of pestilence. A sickness unlike any before has descended. No family, rich or poor, is truly safe. People fall ill with sudden ferocity, fever and pain, strange black swellings in the groin or under the arms, and dark blotches on the skin. Many victims perish only a day or two after the first cough or chill. Fear grips the land. Is it God's wrath? Is it a curse? Panic and bewilderment hang as thick as the stench of sickness in the air. In villages, cottages stand dark with doors marked by red crosses, warning all that plague lurks within. In cities, mass graves are dug outside the walls, and thin columns of smoke rise day and night from pyres where the dead are burned. Life, it seems, is unravelling. Travellers bring terrifying news from all directions, of ports where ghost ships drift ashore with entire crews dead, of villages where not a single living soul remains. The plague moves faster than anyone can comprehend, riding on merchant caravans, stowing away on ships, spreading with an invisible contagion no one knows how to stop. As summer turns to autumn and autumn to winter, the devastation only grows. In some towns, half the population or more is gone within months, taken by this unseen reaper. Survivors huddle in their homes at night, listening to the howling of dogs that roam the streets, having lost their masters. The usual rhythms of medieval life, The ringing of morning church bells, the chatter of crowds at the well, have given way to an eerie stillness and the constant presence of death. And yet, amid the despair, there is a strange hushed beauty in the evenings now. With fewer people, the stars above the countryside shine brighter and more indifferent than ever. Candles flicker in windows as families pray together, their faces drawn and hopeful for mercy. Occasionally, a lonely lute's melody drifts from some attic where a wandering bard shelters for the night, singing a soft lament for the world's sorrow. This is a different kind of darkness, not the ordinary peaceful night one sleeps through, but a long, unending twilight of uncertainty. As the omniscient narrator of this tale, I invite you now to step into this twilight. Let us walk slowly, by lantern light, through the streets and stories of the Black Death. In this journey, firmly grounded in the reality of history yet tinged with the supernatural possibilities whispered of in those fearful days, we shall explore how an age of pestilence can become a landscape of both truth and mystery. Close your eyes and imagine the narrow cobbled lanes of a medieval town after midnight. A damp mist clings to the ground. The air is heavy with the scent of burning herbs and wax. Attempts to ward off the bad air of disease. Down one lane, a shutter bangs in the breeze. Down another, a lone figure, a priest or perhaps a desperate father, hurries by with a cart, the small body of a child wrapped in cloth upon it. There are no footsteps of neighbours coming to help, for each house is locked tight, each family fearing to let the plague in. In the silence, it almost feels like even time has paused to hold its breath. This is the world of our story, a world held between life and death, where every shadow and flicker of light holds a question. Was that the wind or a distant cry, a stray dog, or something else moving just out of sight? We will remain grounded in the truth of what happened in those plague years, yet we will also listen for the subtle, unnerving hints, the eerie possibilities that medieval souls might have sensed in the dark. Prepare yourself, then, for a journey through plague-ravaged cities and isolated villages, through recorded history and lingering legend. In calm, measured tones, by the soft glow of a storyteller's lantern, we venture forth. Our pace will be unhurried, a reflective walk through horrors now long past, where each step reveals both factual history and phantoms of folklore. This is not a tale of overt horror or wild fantasy. It is a contemplation of dread draped in the colours of reality, much like twilight itself blurs the line between day and night. Let the mystery linger in your mind as we begin. Welcome to the age of pestilence, where darkness taught the world to see differently, and where even now the echoes of that time remain, in churchyard stones, in ancient journals, and perhaps in whispers carried on the night breeze. Our story begins. Myth, medicine, and misunderstanding. The plague arrived with no warning and no understanding. In an age long before germs would be known, people grasped for any explanation, any remedy to halt the onslaught. By flickering hearths and in city squares, medieval men and women traded rumours and theories about the plague's origin. Some swore it was a punishment from God, a scourge sent to cleanse sin. Others blamed the stars themselves. In Paris, learned astrologers pointed to a rare alignment of planets in 1345, claiming that a malign conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars had poisoned the air. Many believed the very air was to blame, corrupted by foul odours or an invisible miasma. Thus, as the pestilence raged, people lit bonfires and incense in the streets, hoping sweet smoke would purify the breeze. They carried bouquets of posies and herbs pressed to their noses, the floral scent a small comfort against the imagined deadly vapours outside. Medicine, such as it was in the 14th century, stood helpless before this catastrophe. Physicians in long robes consulted their ancient texts and astrological charts, trying treatment after treatment. Without knowing the true cause, their remedies were often desperate and strange. In one town, a doctor might lance the painful buboes, the swellings, to drain poisons from the blood. In another, healers prescribed potions of ground emeralds, vinegar tonics, or arsenic mixtures. Some recommended holding a live chicken against the swellings, believing the bird would draw out the illness. Others advised patients to sit in sewers or latrines, thinking the foul smell might overpower and chase away the plague, an idea born of the logic that like cures like. People were told to avoid sleep at midday, to abstain from certain foods, or to bathe in rosewater and vinegar. These attempts, hopeful but futile, often did more harm than good. For every person who recovered by chance, hundreds more succumbed. And as the death toll rose, so did the sense of helplessness. In the vacuum of reliable knowledge, myth and superstition flourished. Terrified villagers whispered that witchcraft or evil spirits might be behind the disease. In some regions, rumours spread of a plague hag or deathly apparition roaming from village to village at night, spreading illness like a curse. One such legend told of an old woman, the plague maiden, seen walking the empty streets with a rake or broom. If she carried a broom, she would sweep all souls away, leaving no survivors. If a rake, some might escape through the tines. These were the stories people told in hushed voices, huddled around fires, trying to give shape to the shapeless dread that surrounded them. Any unusual event, a comet in the sky, an earthquake, a strange behaviour of animals, was seized upon as an omen of the plague or a clue to its nature. Without a clear cause, blame often fell on the innocent. In parts of Europe, frightened populations accused minority groups of poisoning wells or casting evil spells to invoke the plague. Tragically, this led to violence. Jewish communities in cities along the Rhine, for example, were attacked by mobs convinced that this must be the work of human malice. These atrocities only added to the suffering born from panic and misunderstanding. Meanwhile, religious fervour took extreme forms. Bands of the flagellants roamed from town to town, shirtless in the cold, whipping themselves bloody as penance, believing that self-punishment would atone for humanity's sins and persuade God to lift the plague. People joined their processions, hoping that by witnessing and sharing in the suffering they might find mercy. The sound of their chants and the crack of their whips became yet another unsettling melody in the symphony of plague-stricken Europe. Even the educated and powerful were not immune to desperate measures. In Avignon, the Pope's own physicians recommended an unusual form of protection: to sit between large blazing fires day and night. They believed the flames' heat and smoke would cleanse the air of any pestilential matter. And so Pope Clement VI did exactly that. He isolated himself within his palace, surrounded by roaring hearths, making the very air around him stiflingly hot and smoky. Strangely, this may have saved his life, though not for the reasons his doctors thought. The intense heat likely kept fleas, the real carriers of the plague, at bay. Clement survived, one of the few in Avignon who did, and he later proclaimed that the plague was indeed an instrument of God's anger, while also granting forgiveness to all who died of it. So enormous was the scale of suffering. For common folk, protection often meant charms and folk medicine. Some wore amulets, inscribed with prayers or mystical words like abracadabra in diminishing triangles, hoping to ward off illness. Children might be given dried toads to carry in their pockets, a curious talisman meant to absorb the disease. Housewives burned aromatic woods or vinegar on the stove. Many households kept bonfires of juniper and rosemary crackling at their doorsteps, creating fragrant smoke screens against the night. And if one member of a family took ill, it was not uncommon for others to flee their own home, a heartbreaking decision, leaving the sick behind, hoping to save themselves. Love and duty battled daily with fear. Countless tales speak of servants loyally tending dying masters, of mothers refusing to abandon their feverish children, but also of friends and kin vanishing in the dark to avoid contagion, never to return. In this climate of confusion, the line between real medicine and hopeful magic blurred. Town councils passed measures to clean the streets of garbage and waste, not realising they were indirectly doing something useful by disturbing the rats and fleas at the plague's true heart. Cities like Venice, hit hard by the outbreak, instituted quarantines, a practice new to the world. Incoming ships had to anchor for 40 giorni, 40 days, before anyone could disembark, an idea born from cautious observation that seemed to help in some cases. It was one of the few measures rooted in a dim understanding that the sickness spread from person to person. But in 1348 these efforts were only just beginning and far from widespread. Most people relied on prayer, on rituals and remedies, and on sheer luck. And so, under the eerie glow of a blood-red moon or the grey light of a sun obscured by persistent haze, medieval communities did what they could to fight an incomprehensible horror. They wore masks of cloth over their faces, or even bizarre beaked masks filled with perfumed spices, an innovation that would become iconic in later outbreaks. Imagine the unsettling sight of a plague doctor in his long waxed coat and bird-like mask, moving through empty streets with a stick in hand to examine patients without touching them directly. They placed their faith in saints, St. Sebastian or St. Roch, patrons invoked against plague, erecting statues or leaving small offerings of thanks or pleading in roadside shrines. When all cures failed, many turned to fervent prayer and processions when such gatherings hadn't been banned. Candles were lit day and night in cathedrals to pray for deliverance from this great pestilence. But as the weeks turned to months, one by one the candles sputtered out, and there were often too few clergy left to say masses for the dead. Medicine had broken under the weight of the unknown. Misunderstanding and myth filled that void, offering comfort or scapegoats, or at least some narrative to hold on to. And as we shall see in our journey, out of this tapestry of desperate explanations and treatments would emerge not only tragedy, but also stories, some based in reality, others in the supernatural that would be told for generations to come. The human need to make sense of the senseless gave birth to tales of both wisdom and wonder, heroism and horror. In the midst of plague, medieval people walked on a razor's edge between the visible and invisible, between what they knew of the world and what they could only imagine in the dark. Known plagues versus the Black Death. Pestilence was not unknown to history. Before the Black Death struck, people had heard echoes of ancient plagues in songs and scriptures. There were tales of the biblical plagues of Egypt, of a great pestilence that once ravaged the ancient city of Athens during wartime, and of other illnesses that had periodically swept through villages every few generations. But nothing, truly nothing, prepared the medieval world for the scale of the Black Death. To understand the sheer dread it inspired, one must see it in contrast to what came before. Long ago, in the 6th century, there had been another mighty plague, what we now call the Plague of Justinian. It struck the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire around 541 AD, decimating the imperial city of Constantinople and then radiating outward. Chroniclers of that era described carts overflowing with bodies and a death toll so high that 10,000 people were said to die in a single day at the epidemic's peak in Constantinople. That plague too had spread far and wide, bringing entire regions to their knees. It lingered on and off for years, flaring up across the Mediterranean. By the time it faded, millions were dead. To those who remembered, it must have seemed like the worst disaster imaginable. Yet, by the 14th century, the plague of Justinian was a distant memory, preserved only in dusty books and half-forgotten chronicles. The world moved on, populations grew again, and the horror of pandemic pestilence slipped into the realm of legend. Centuries later, the Black Death erupted with a fury that made even that ancient catastrophe pale. Between 1347 and 1353, wave after wave of plague rolled across Asia, the Middle East, North Africa and Europe. Modern estimates suggest that across Europe alone, the Black Death claimed the lives of roughly 1/3 of the population in some cities and towns. Over 1/2 of the people perished within a year. Imagine a village of 300 souls nestled in a green valley. By the end of the plague, perhaps only 150 or fewer remain, standing amidst a quiet of absence, each survivor having buried friend, sibling, parent or child. No corner of society was spared. Rich and poor, knight and peasant, monk and merchant, death made no distinction. Unlike earlier plagues that might strike at the poor or the crowded but leave nobles relatively unscathed, this plague entered palaces and cottages alike. The sheer scale was something even the stories of old hadn't described. It felt as if the world itself was dying. People during the Black Death sometimes wondered if this was the same pestilence from ancient times come again. Medieval scholars spoke of the Great Pestilence in the time of Justinian, and debated if the current plague was of a similar nature or a brand new visitation of God's wrath. Some drew parallels to the diseases described in the Bible, or to local lore of previous bad airs that caused illness. But soon it became clear that the Black Death was unprecedented in living memory. The number of dead, the speed of spread, the way it turned daily life upside down, it was beyond compare. Even the Mongol Khans of the East and the caliphs of the Islamic world, who had contended with epidemics now and then, were staggered by this one. In faraway lands like India and China too, the pestilence cut swathes of destruction. Though news travelled slowly, and Europeans only learned fragments of those tales, it seemed global, unstoppable. It's important to realise that what we call the Black Death was just the beginning of an era of recurring plague outbreaks, the second pandemic of plague. The initial shock of 1347 to 1351 was the deadliest wave, but the disease did not vanish afterward. Every decade or so, smaller outbreaks would flare up in one region or another. Perhaps not as apocalyptic as the first, but still cruel. A town might lose a quarter of its people in 1361, and then again in 1372. A grim rhythm set in. Entire generations grew up under the shadow of plague's possible return. Over the next 3 centuries, plague would visit London, Paris, Venice, Cairo, and countless other places multiple times. Each occurrence would be greeted with that old dread, though communities slowly developed better responses, quarantine laws, pest houses to isolate the sick, and more systematic care. Yet, no matter how often it returned, the Black Death of the 14th century remained the yardstick of terror, the event against which all other plagues were measured. For context, consider some other great plagues in history. The Antonine Plague in the 2nd century, likely a form of smallpox, ravaged the Roman Empire for years and possibly killed millions, including the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. The Plague of Athens in 430 BC, whose cause is still debated by historians, wiped out a huge portion of that city during the Peloponnesian War, and even claimed their great leader Pericles. These were devastating in their times, altering wars and societies. But in medieval Europe, such events were nearly forgotten or known only vaguely. To the people of the 1340s, It felt like the wrath of God or nature had never before struck so fiercely. Perhaps only the tales of the biblical flood or the end-of-world apocalypse seemed fitting to describe what was happening. As the Black Death swept on, some chroniclers wrote that it must surely be the end of days foretold in holy texts. One Italian writer, observing the empty homes and streets, mused that so many have died that all believe it is the end of the world. In many regions there were not enough living to till the fields or harvest the crops, and famine threatened to follow plague. Wolves were said to wander boldly into abandoned villages, finding no resistance. The fabric of medieval society, tightly woven by feudal obligations, church teachings and community bonds, began to fray. The enormous death toll of the Black Death shook the foundations of the feudal system itself. With so many labourers gone, survivors could demand better wages or leave their lord's land in search of opportunity elsewhere. Something unthinkable a generation earlier. Historians later would see this as a turning point. The old medieval world beginning to give way to new social arrangements, even sowing seeds for the Renaissance that followed. In that sense, the plague was a portal to profound change, but we will reflect more on that in the end. We can also compare the Black Death to what came after it in Europe. 2 centuries later, in 1665, the Great Plague of London struck the English capital, a terrible outbreak in which perhaps 1 in 5 Londoners died. It was a nightmare for that city, vividly recorded by those like Samuel Pepys in his diary. Yet even that Great Plague was minor compared to the Black Death of 1348, which in some cities killed 1 in 2. The village of Ayam, which we shall discuss soon, lost around 260 of its 350 inhabitants in 1665 to 66. A devastating loss indeed, but many medieval villages in 1348 lost everyone. By the 17th century, people at least had some frameworks. Quarantine, the knowledge that staying away from the sick could help, whereas in 1348, communities were caught utterly off guard. Thus, the Black Death stands in history as the greatest pandemic in terms of percentage of population lost in a short time. It was the darkest benchmark of mass mortality, a spectre so grim that later generations would invoke it in literature, art and superstition whenever speaking of catastrophe. The phrase Black Death itself, though coined after the medieval period, captures the haunting finality it brought. Death, like a black cloak covering all. Known plagues of earlier times were deadly but limited. This one was near universal and relentless. Keep in mind, however, that amid this unparalleled disaster humanity persevered. Survivors picked up the pieces and carried on. Life, as it has a stubborn way of doing, returned slowly to empty streets. Babies were born to replace some of the lost. Grass grew over plague pits and new houses were built. But scars remained in memory and in the stories passed down. The Black Death so deeply carved itself into the collective mind that even now, centuries later, we're recounting its tale with a shiver. It became more than a historical event. It became a mythos of its own, inspiring cautionary tales, ghost stories and reflections on mortality. Now that we have set the Black Death in the context of other plagues, seeing how unique and world-changing it was, we turn to the voices of those who lived through it. In the next section, real accounts from that time will ground us in the reality of suffering and resilience. These accounts are not fiction, they are the truth as people saw it, and they are the soil from which many uncanny legends later grew. Listen closely to their words, for they carry the weight of lived experience and set the stage for the eerier tales yet to come. Real historical accounts. Throughout the plague years, a few brave or learned souls took up quill and ink to record what they witnessed. Their accounts, written in letters, chronicles or diaries, give us windows into the raw reality of the Black Death, scenes so harrowing that they scarcely need any embellishment to chill the blood. Let us hear some of those voices and stories now, in calm reverence, as if turning the pages of an old manuscript by candlelight. In the Tuscan city of Siena, Italy, a man named Agnolo di Tura wrote of the devastation that befell his town. His words are heavy with sorrow. In many places in Siena, great pits were dug and piled deep with a multitude of dead, and there were also those so sparsely covered with earth that dogs dragged them forth and devoured many bodies throughout the city. Agnolo witnessed horrors unimaginable. He speaks of mass graves filled layer upon layer with corpses, like cheese between layers of lasagna, as one later chronicler phrased it. In a heart-wrenching personal note, Agnolo adds, "I buried my 5 children with my own hands." You can almost feel his numb disbelief as he records such a task, the father digging graves for his beloved children, alone, no funeral prayers, no mourners, just the sound of his shovel in the dirt and the silence of a city of the dead around him. He ends by saying, "And so many died that all believed it was the end of the world." Such was the scene in Siena, and Siena was far from alone. Travel north to Florence, and we find the famous writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived the plague there. In the introduction to his collection of stories, The Decameron, Boccaccio describes Florence in 1348, gripped by panic and despair. He writes of people reacting in drastically different ways. Some shut themselves away, refusing all contact and living off meagre provisions, attempting to wait out the plague in strict isolation. These in his tale are mirrored by the 10 youths who flee to the countryside to tell each other stories. Others did the opposite. They indulged in wild revels, feasting and drinking as if each night might be their last, trying to forget the carnage around them. And many, Boccaccio notes somberly, carried posies of flowers or herbs to their noses to mask the stench of death that was everywhere. He tells how normal social bonds broke down. Brothers abandoned brothers, wives abandoned husbands, and even parents would abandon their own children in a desperate bid to avoid infection. The sick were often left to die alone, with none but maybe a loyal servant or a pitying neighbour to deliver food or water at a distance. Boccaccio recounts that so many died so fast that the usual funeral rites collapsed. The dead were carried out of houses daily in such numbers that biers and coffins were reused multiple times, or dispensed with altogether. Corpses were laid in trenches without ceremony, dozens at a time. He describes corpses being buried en masse, each new layer of bodies covered lightly with earth until the pit was full, much as we heard from Siena. Even the churches, he says, became makeshift charnel houses when cemeteries overflowed. It's a scene of societal breakdown. Law, trade, crafts, everything simply stopped or greatly faltered, because so many were ill or afraid. From Avignon, the seat of the papacy in 1348, we have another vivid scene. The Pope's personal physician and other observers wrote of how Avignon was transformed. This was a city teeming with clergy, merchants, pilgrims, suddenly turned into a hotbed of contagion. At the plague's height, it's said that over 400 people died each day in Avignon. Pope Clement VI, as mentioned, resorted to extraordinary measures. He kept fires burning in his chambers and refused to venture out, except to direct the immense charitable efforts the church undertook, collecting and burying bodies, tending to the sick where possible, and saying Mass for the dead. But even the church's resources were stretched thin. We hear that Clement eventually consecrated the entire Rhone River as holy ground. This was unprecedented. A river, holy ground, so that the countless bodies could be cast into the water and given at least a semblance of a Christian burial by touching consecrated waters. One can picture that wide river flowing past Avignon, bloated bodies gently floating away on its currents because the graveyards had no room left. We also find a letter from the Pope lamenting that so many of his priests and bishops had died performing their duties that replacements had to be ordained in haste, often lacking experience just to ensure someone remained to perform last rites. The air in Avignon, one chronicler noted, hung heavy with the smoke of funeral pyres and the aroma of herbs, a city literally engulfed in fumes of death and desperate purification. From the cities to the countryside, the plague did not spare the rural folk. Accounts from England, for example, note that in many villages entire families perished. One English chronicler writes of a village where, when harvest time came, there was no one left to reap the crops in the fields. They rotted where they stood. In monasteries, monks who lived in communal closeness were especially vulnerable. There are abbey records that show entries like, "All brothers dead, the abbey vacant." In one monastery near Winchester, 48 out of 50 monks died in a matter of weeks. The two survivors, it's said, wandered the empty cloisters, tending as they could to the corpses of their brethren, before even they moved on or disappeared from the record. And yet, amid this desolation, there were glimmers of compassion and sacrifice. Let us travel, as promised, to a little village in the north of England, Am, in Derbyshire. Although Am's story comes from a later outbreak in 1665 to 1666, long after the first Black Death, it stands as a testament to human courage in the face of plague and is a real account worth including. Am was a quiet village of perhaps a few hundred souls nestled in the hills. In the late summer of 1665, the tailor received a package of cloth from London for his trade. Unbeknownst to anyone, that cloth carried infected fleas. The tailor's assistant, George Vickers, was the first to fall ill after hanging up the damp cloth before the fire. He died within days. Soon, others in the village came down with the dreaded swellings and fevers. By spring of 1666, panic threatened to drive the villagers to flee across the countryside. Had they done so, they might have carried the plague to many neighbouring communities, causing untold death. But Am's villagers made an extraordinary decision. Under the guidance of their pastor, Reverend William Mompesson, and the former pastor, Thomas Stanley, whom the people trusted, they agreed to quarantine themselves, sealing off their village from the outside world. They drew a boundary line around Am which no one would cross. Nearby villages left food and supplies at designated stones on the outskirts, like the famed Boundary Stone, where coins from Am were left soaking in vinegar as a disinfectant in exchange for goods. Through this act of self-sacrifice, Am prevented the plague from spreading further in that region of England. But the cost was heartrending. Am's people were essentially sentencing themselves to death to save others. And indeed, over the course of that year, death visited nearly every home. Entire families were wiped out. One story often told is of Elizabeth Hancock, an Am mother who buried her husband and 6 children within a span of 8 days in the summer of 1666, digging their graves herself in a field now known as the Riley Graves. Yet she miraculously never fell ill, walking back and forth, alone, between her cottage and the graves with each new tragedy. One can imagine her, day after day, under the hot sun and then the rain, opening the ground for those she loved most, with only the distant, silent hills as witnesses. In another house, a tailor named Marshall Howe survived the plague early, and then bravely assumed the grim duty of burying the dead of Am. He had perhaps gained immunity. On November 1st, 1666, the last victim, a farm labourer, succumbed. His name was Abraham Morton, and with his death, the epidemic in Am finally ended. Out of roughly 350 villagers, 260 had died. Fewer than 100 emerged alive when the quarantine lifted. But their sacrifice meant the surrounding villages saw no plague at all. Iam's story is real and recorded, a beacon of both tragedy and heroism. To this day, the little village is remembered for its selfless act, and one can visit its churchyard and see the inscriptions of 1665 to 66, a roll call of sorrow and bravery. We recount it here not only for its historical value, but because such extreme events often bred whispers of the supernatural. Some said that Iam was cursed, others that it was blessed, depending on how they interpreted the village's fate. But in truth, it was ordinary people making an extraordinary choice. There are countless other accounts. In the city of Venice, officials noted how the lagoon waters rose to carry away the loads of bodies dumped from boats at sea. In Paris, a poet lamented that the streets flowed with tears and blood, and none are left to comfort. In German towns, notes in parish registers simply stopped for the year 1349, only to resume in 1350 with short comments like, "Here it was that the mortality ended." From the Middle East, the great traveller Ibn Battuta wrote of Damascus in 1348, where the citizens held a massive prayer procession, pleading for relief as thousands died each day. A Syrian chronicler, Ibn al-Wadi, wrote that the smell of death became familiar and described people dropping in the streets, with kind strangers covering the bodies with mats until they could be collected. In one particularly moving letter from the city of Aleppo, the writer describes how servants buried masters, then died, how wives prepared their husbands for burial, then followed them swiftly to the grave. The letter ends with a poignant line, "The living are exhausted in burying the dead." These real historical accounts ground our understanding. The plague was a very human tragedy, composed of countless individual griefs and acts of love or desperation. They show that while some people responded with fear or even cruelty, others responded with profound courage, compassion, or faith. Each village and city had its own stories of heartbreak, mothers searching for lost children in empty houses, priests who walked into infected homes to give last rites knowing it might doom them as well, doctors who worked until they collapsed, or those who fled at the first chance, leaving towns doctorless. As we read these accounts centuries later, by the gentle glow of reflection, it's almost as if we can hear their voices echoing. Agnolo in Siena, Boccaccio in Florence, the priests of Avignon, the villagers of Iam, all telling us this happened. We were there. We saw these things and we endured. Their records are the foundation of truth on which even the eeriest legends rest. When people said it felt like hell had come to earth, or that ghosts surely walked among the plague-stricken, these were not wild exaggerations to those who lived it. It truly felt that way. And so, armed with these truths, we turn now to the paranormal possibilities, the stories and folklore that grew out of such times. These are the tales told when the candles burned low and the night was at its darkest, tales that hover between reality and the supernatural. They do not appear in official chronicles, perhaps, but in the murmured lore passed down through generations. We will explore them with the same calm, measured gaze, not to say that they surely happened as told, but to understand what people felt and believed in those moments when dread opened the door to the unknown. Paranormal Encounter 1: The Cursed Village. Our first tale of the uncanny takes us to a remote corner of Europe during the height of the Black Death, a place whispered of in local folklore simply as the Cursed Village. By day, if one were to stumble upon it, this village might not have seemed much different from any other small hamlet. It sat in a green valley, ringed by dense woods, with a crystal stream running beside it. The cottages were humble wattle and daub huts with thatched roofs, and a tiny stone chapel stood at its centre. But what set it apart was not seen in its appearance. It was the silence. For in this village, according to the legend, No one survived the Great Plague, not a single soul. Imagine approaching this place as a traveller in late 1350, after the worst of the plague's first wave had passed through the region. You're a messenger or a pilgrim, perhaps, weary on horseback, cresting a hill at twilight. You see below you the outlines of a village in the dimming light. There are fields, but they look untended, crops bending wild and unharvested. Smoke curls thinly from a few chimneys, which gives you hope that someone is alive down there keeping a fire. The sun is just sinking, painting the sky in bands of red and purple. You decide to seek shelter in the village for the night, as darkness will soon make travelling dangerous on the forest road. Leading your horse down the slope, you call out a greeting as you near the first cottage. "Hello, peace be with you. Any travellers lodge here?" Your voice seems to fall flat. There's no immediate response, just the echo of your words against the trees. You notice something odd. A wheelbarrow lies tipped over by the road, its load of logs spilled, as if whoever was pushing it left in a great hurry or simply vanished. A little further, by another home, a wooden bucket full of water sits by the well, moss gathering on its rim. The water inside is stagnant, reflecting the sky. The door of that cottage is ajar. From within comes a faint creak, perhaps of a shutter swaying. No voices, no footsteps. An uneasy feeling begins to gnaw at your stomach. The traveller ties his horse to a post and ventures toward the chapel in the centre of the village. If anyone is here, perhaps they've gathered at the church. As he walks, he sees more signs of abrupt abandonment. A market stall in the small village square still has some cloth and trinkets on display, now covered in dust and bird droppings. A baker's oven by one hut has loaves inside burnt to black charcoal. Whoever lit this fire never returned to pull them out. The entire village feels frozen in time, caught in the middle of ordinary life, yet utterly devoid of life. Reaching the chapel yard, the traveller finds freshly dug graves, dozens of them. Some have markers, simple wooden crosses, but many are just mounds of earth, sunken in where bodies lay underneath. By now, the light is fading fast and a sense of dread solidifies. This is a plague village. Perhaps at one time the villagers here quarantined themselves like Am would do centuries later, or perhaps the disease struck too quickly for anyone to flee. Regardless, it appears no one lived to tell outsiders what happened here. The traveller realises he may be entirely alone in this place, or rather, alone among the dead. He steps into the tiny chapel, pushing open its heavy wooden door. The hinges groan. Inside, the last sliver of sun casts coloured patterns through a stained glass of a saint on the far wall. The air smells of wax and something musty. In the dimness, he sees them. A row of figures seated in the pews. His heart jumps. People. He moves closer and gives a gentle cry of greeting, but the figures do not stir. With a trembling hand, the traveller raises his lantern and the light reveals the truth. They are statues, mannequins of straw and cloth dressed in villagers' clothes, propped up in the pews. Someone, perhaps in desperation or delirium, arranged them there. Or could it be the villagers, knowing death was at hand, crafted effigies of themselves to fill the church in a final act of faith, hoping that, in absence of a priest, these congregants might stand in for their souls? It is a chilling sight. The lantern light flickers on painted faces that stare lifelessly ahead. On the altar, the traveller notices, lies a small book and a rosary. The book is a Bible, and a passage about pestilence is bookmarked, though he cannot read in the dark which verse it is. He senses that whoever made this eerie tableau perhaps sought comfort or absolution at the last hour. The traveller decides not to stay in the chapel. The uncanny congregation gives him shivers. Instead, he finds a relatively intact cottage nearby and settles in for the night. barricading the door against wild animals. The hearth has wood. He manages to spark a fire. As flames crackle and shadows dance on the walls, the fatigue of the day catches up and he dozes off in a chair, an open blanket round his shoulders. It's in the depth of night, with the fire reduced to glowing embers, that something awakens him. Was it a sound? He holds his breath, listening. Yes, there. A faint noise from outside, like footsteps on dry leaves or the rustle of fabric. The traveller peers through a gap in the boarded window. The moon is out, casting a silvery light over the village. At first he sees nothing unusual. Then, near the edge of the village square, he perceives a shape. It looks like a person, moving slowly. Could someone have survived after all? The figure is hooded or wearing a shawl. They move with a peculiar gait, pausing at one house, then another, as if looking for something, or someone. The traveller's mouth goes dry. He debates whether to call out, but something holds him back, an instinct or fear. Instead, quietly, he slips out the back door of the cottage, determined to get a clearer view while keeping a safe distance. Sticking to the shadows, he creeps behind a low stone wall. From this vantage, he now sees the village square clearly. The figure is still there. In the moonlight, it appears to be an old woman, clad in a dark dress with a white cap or veil over her hair. She's clutching something in her hand. Perhaps a walking stick, or is it a rake? The traveller isn't sure. She bends down slowly and seems to draw a circle or pattern on the ground with whatever she is holding. Then she stands and tilts her head, as if listening. The traveller hears nothing but the sigh of wind in the trees. The old woman then moves again, out of the square and down the lane toward the chapel. Despite every instinct telling him not to, the traveller's curiosity compels him to follow at a distance. He watches as the old woman nears the chapel yard with the graves. She stops by each grave mound and stands a moment. Her shoulders heave. Could she be sobbing or laughing? The traveller cannot tell from so far, and the sound doesn't carry. Finally she reaches the last grave near the chapel door. She crouches and seems to caress the earth, almost lovingly. The traveller leans forward, straining to see. Just then a cloud passes over the moon, dimming the light. In the partial darkness he loses sight of her form. He waits. Minutes pass, the moon comes out again, the chapel yard is empty. The old woman is gone. Heart pounding, the traveller summons courage and approaches the chapel once more, now under the moon's glow. The graves lie peaceful, nothing out of place, except the rosary that was on the altar earlier is now hanging on the chapel's door latch, gently swaying. And on the fresh earth of the last grave, there is something new. A small posy of wild flowers, recently picked and tied with a strip of homespun cloth. The blossoms are still dewy. Whoever left them must have done so just moments ago. A cold realization washes over the traveller. Perhaps the old woman he saw was not of flesh and blood. Could it be the spirit of a villager, a mother or grandmother, lingering in this cursed place to mourn those buried here? Or an embodiment of the plague maiden herself, visiting the resting places of her victims with a final token? He feels an overwhelming sadness more than fear, an empathy for this lonely spectre, if spectre it was, pacing through the village it once loved. With trembling lips, he offers a quiet prayer for the souls of the departed and for the lonely phantom wandering under the moon. The traveller leaves at first light, eager to quit the silent village. Riding away, he glances back to see morning mist curling through the empty streets. He notices that his horse's hooves fall silent as they pass the boundary of the village, as if the very ground holds its breath within that place. Years later, when he recounts this story in a far-off inn, listeners will shake their heads, some in scepticism, some in awe. The village, they say, was known to be completely wiped out by plague. That much is documented. But as for the old woman's ghost, who can say? Perhaps she was real, a solitary survivor the traveller failed to meet in daylight, performing strange rituals in her grief. Or perhaps it was just a dream of his travel-weary mind. But a few elders trading tales by the fire will recall other rumours, of villagers seen walking after death, of church bells that rang with no hand to pull them. On some nights, locals claim they heard the chapel bell of the empty village toll at midnight, a lonely sound across the valley. They call it cursed, that valley, a place where the veil between life and death was so frayed by the plague that something lingered, not at rest. And so the legend of the cursed village lives on. It stands as a dark mirror to the real fate of so many villages that truly perished in the Black Death. Places simply erased from maps and memory except for a line in a chronicle. Here, everyone died. The tale suggests that in such absolute tragedy, perhaps some remnant, some echo of the people remains, a ghostly guardian, a mournful presence that cannot let go. Whether one believes in ghosts or not, the image is powerful. An empty village lit by moonlight, and a lone figure wandering, tending graves that no living kin remain to tend. In the calm of our narration, we need not declare it fact or fancy. We simply acknowledge that this is how the story was told, to convey the depth of sorrow that plague left in its wake. A cursed village, indeed, or maybe just a tragic one, where an entire human community was silenced, leaving only silence for the imagination to fill. Paranormal Encounter 2: The Plague Doctor Who Never Left. Our next encounter takes us from the deserted countryside to the narrow winding streets of an old city. A city that has seen plague visit more than once. Imagine a city like Venice, with its labyrinth of canals and alleys, or perhaps London's medieval lanes, or the dark, winding streets of Prague. In many such cities, long after the plagues of the past had ended, stories emerged of something, or someone, that still walked those streets as a reminder of the bygone horrors. One enduring legend speaks of the plague doctor who never left. Picture a foggy evening in the city centuries ago. The year might be 1700, well after the last major plague outbreak, but memory is long. A tavern by the waterfront is warm with chatter as sailors and locals swap stories over ale. One sailor, passing through, mentions that he will avoid a certain side of town come nightfall. When pressed, he leans in and shares a curious tale he heard from a dock worker. They say, on quiet nights, you can see a strange doctor roaming near the old plague pit cemetery. A doctor with a bird's face. A hush falls over the group. They've heard the rumours too. The legend varies in detail from teller to teller, but here is a composite of how it's often told. During the last great epidemic in the city, be it Venice's 1575 plague, or Prague's 1713 outbreak, or London's 1665 plague, there was a certain plague doctor who distinguished himself. While many physicians fled or shut themselves away when plague struck, this doctor stayed behind, tending to the afflicted in the poorest quarters day and night. He wore the usual garb of his profession at that time, a long waxed cloak, gloves, a wide-brimmed hat, and that iconic beaked mask with glass eye holes, a mask stuffed with herbs and flowers to filter the bad air, equipped with a stick to examine patients or ward off desperate crowds without direct touch. He braved the worst of it. Let's give him a name for the sake of the story. Say Dr. Elias Voss, though some call him by other names in other cities. Dr. Voss became a familiar sight in the plague-ridden streets, going where few else would go, into the underground cellars where the sick lay on straw, into the overfilled pest houses, even through quarantined homes marked with red crosses. He could not save many lives, for no doctor then truly knew a cure, but he offered what aid he could, lancing buboes, administering tinctures of garlic or mercury, comforting the dying with soft words and prayers. Neighbours recalled seeing him stop to lift a fallen child on the road, or to give a sip of water to an old man left on a stoop. Over months of tireless work he saved perhaps a handful, and gave dignity to many more in death. Eventually, inevitably, Dr. Voss too fell ill. Some say it was after he removed his mask briefly to eat, inhaling the contagion. Others say a patient in feverish delirium ripped the mask off his face, exposing him. In any case, he contracted the plague. Yet even as he grew weak, he did not cease his rounds. Witnesses spoke of seeing him, tottering but determined, still making his way through the alleys at dusk, lantern in hand, coughing as he went, the beaked mask concealing the reality that he himself now had the telltale black swellings on his neck. His colleagues begged him to rest, to take to his bed, but he refused, insisting that as long as he could walk, he had patients to see. Dr. Voss was found one morning collapsed on the steps of a church, beneath the statue of a saint. He was dead. In his hand was his journal, in which he had meticulously recorded the names of the dead and dying under his care, perhaps the last act of a compassionate scientist trying to maintain order in chaos. The city mourned him quietly. So many deaths had occurred that one more hardly made difference to the statistics, but those who knew of his selflessness felt a deep loss. He was buried, fittingly, near the mass graves of the plague victims, at his request, rather than in a fancy family tomb. His mask and cloak were burned, as was customary to disinfect the belongings of the plague dead. But that, it seems, was not the end of Dr. Voss's story. Not according to the legends. They say that sometime after the epidemic had subsided, strange sightings began. A gondolier in Venice claimed that on a misty night he saw a lone gondola gliding along the canal with no one rowing it, and inside, standing upright, was a tall figure in a black cloak and a white-beaked mask, gazing silently at the passing city. Elsewhere, a night watchman making rounds near an old plague cemetery swore he encountered a man in a long coat and hat walking slowly among the tombstones. The watchman called out, asking if he needed help, perhaps thinking it some lost elderly doctor from the hospital. The figure turned, and even though dusk was thick, the watchman clearly saw the outline of that grotesque bird-like mask. It regarded him for a moment, then simply vanished behind a crypt. When the watchman rushed over, there was nobody there. Only the faint smell of roses and vinegar lingered, reminiscent of the herbs plague doctors used. Stories like this multiplied. A mother nursing her baby by an open window at midnight gasped as she saw a dark figure with a long, beak-like nose peering up at her from the street, as if checking on the household. Then it tipped its hat and moved on, dissolving into the shadows. Children said they saw a birdman in the abandoned plague hospital at the edge of town, hearing the tap of his staff on the floorboards echo down the halls. Sailors on ships docked in quarantine claimed a man in old doctor's robes climbed aboard to examine them at night. But he left no footprints and did not answer when spoken to. Over time, the city folk gave this spectre a name. Dr. Death, some called him bluntly, or the Grey Physician, or simply the Plague Doctor Ghost. Interpretations varied. Some believed it was truly the spirit of Dr. Voss, or whatever name the local legend gave him, who was so dutiful in life that even in death he continued his rounds, especially whenever plague threatened anew. There were whispers during later small outbreaks. People would say, "The plague doctor's ghost was seen last week. Illness must be coming," almost as if he were a harbinger or guardian. Others thought the apparition was not the benevolent doctor at all, but a darker thing, perhaps death itself donning a familiar form to walk among the living. After all, the image of a plague doctor is not so far from the Grim Reaper. Instead of a scythe and skull face, the Reaper here wears a beak and carries a cane. It was a satisfying metaphor for some that death had worn a mask and walked openly in their streets during the plague, and sometimes the ghostly doctor still did. Skeptics, of course, had more mundane explanations. They suggested that perhaps some pranksters or thieves dressed up in old plague doctor costumes to scare people at night, using the city's superstition to cover their crimes. Indeed, there were instances of bandits donning the outfit to approach victims, knowing people would keep distance from what they thought was a plague worker or ghost. Others mused that maybe the sightings were simply hallucinations, the product of trauma and lingering fear. A person who lost family to plague might, in a half-dreaming state, imagine the doctor that tended them still walking by. The smell of herbs, the tap of a cane, these could be half-remembered sensory memories triggered by something ordinary. Yet, despite these rational voices, the legend persisted strongly in local culture. Some households would leave a lantern burning in the window on certain nights, as if to signal to the ghostly doctor, "No need to stop here, we are well," or conversely to invite his protection if illness struck. Children were warned not to follow any strange figure at night, especially one with a bird mask, a grim twist on a cautionary tale too. Keep kids from wandering off. One particularly eerie account tells of a physician in the late 18th century who rented a centuries-old building as his new clinic. This building had once been used as a plague infirmary long ago. The young doctor wrote in a letter that at times he felt uneasy in the place. Occasionally, when working late by lamplight, he thought he glimpsed, just out of the corner of his eye, another silhouette in the room, tall, cloaked, watching quietly. When he would turn to look squarely, nothing was there. On one occasion he came back to his desk to find his papers disturbed and a particular medical text open to a chapter on fevers, as though someone had been perusing it. He even heard faint coughing down the hall when he was alone, as Dr. Voss had died coughing. The doctor wasn't one to believe in ghosts, but he admitted in his letter that he sometimes whispered, "Thank you, friend," into the air, just in case the benevolent spirit of the plague doctor was indeed around, lending guidance from beyond. In recounting this legend in our soft, measured tone, we need not accept nor dismiss it entirely. What's clear is that the plague doctor became an enduring symbol, so much so that people half expected to see his tall, ominous form long after he should have been gone. The supernatural element underscores how the memory of plague and those who fought it left an indelible mark. A doctor who gave his life to duty becomes, in story, a restless soul unable to leave the disease-ridden world behind. It is both a haunting thought and, oddly, a comforting one. If indeed his ghost lingered, at least someone, or something, remained to watch over the sick when others fled. As you imagine those narrow alleys under flickering, gaslight or lamplight, and the faint outline of a figure at the far end, cape fluttering in a breeze, ask yourself, in the quiet of night, how easily could the eye and mind be fooled? And if you were that lonely plague doctor's spirit, would you have the strength to depart after seeing so much suffering? Or would you too feel bound to continue, hoping beyond hope to prevent one more death? The story of the plague doctor who never left straddles the line between heroism and ghostly terror, reminding us that great traumas can echo for ages, and sometimes the past feels so present that it might as well be a spectre at our shoulder. Paranormal Encounter 3: The Isolated Survivor's Journal. Our final encounter unfolds in the first person, through the pages of an old journal discovered in the attic of a farmhouse, or perhaps in the archives of a monastery. The ink is faded brown, the pages brittle, but the words are legible. It appears to be the diary of a man who lived through the plague in isolation. As we read from it, Picture yourself as the narrator, a solitary survivor, writing by the light of a dying candle while the world around you falls silent. The style here will be immersive, as if we are hearing his voice across time. June 12th, 1349. I'm not sure what day of the week it is anymore. The church bells have stopped ringing long since. By my reckoning it is June. I've been alone for 9 weeks. I ought to keep better count, but the mind wanders in solitude. I will write to preserve my sanity if nothing else. My name is Tommaso, and I fear I may be the last living soul in our village. God have mercy. It began in early spring. News of a great mortality in the cities reached us late. We were a small hamlet in the hills, far from any trade routes. We heard whispers of a sickness down in the valley. Some didn't believe it, or thought we'd be spared by distance. But then old Pietro returned from market one day, terribly ill. By the next morning his wife found him dead, black boils under his arms. Within days half her household was gravely sick. It spread like wildfire. Families shut themselves in. Our priest, Father Julian, went house to comfort and pray. He was the bravest of us. He fell ill by the second week and died 2 days later. After that there was no more mass, no more sacraments. The living had only their own prayers. I'm writing this from the loft of my father's farmhouse, up on the slope overlooking the village. I made a decision when I saw the first deaths. I took some supplies and locked myself up here away from everyone, even my own kin. Cowardly, perhaps, but I felt an icy dread and a voice inside telling me this was the only way to survive. My family, God forgive me, went on to tend the sick and help bury the dead. One by one, I saw them from this very window being carried on carts to the churchyard. My father, my 2 brothers, even little Anna, my niece who was just 5, wrapped in linen and taken by. I could not even weep out loud for fear someone might hear I was here and beg for help I could not give. I have had to choke down my grief in silence. There are moments I regretted my choice. What life have I saved if all I have now is loneliness and guilt? Each day I awaken to silence. Sometimes I think I've gone deaf, but it is only the hush of death all around. No roosters crow anymore, no dogs bark. There were moments I wished for the howling of Pietro's old hound. I saw that poor creature wandering, now masterless, and then even it disappeared. Perhaps starved, perhaps taken by wolves. Only the wind and the distant rush of the river below remind me that sound still exists. June 20th, 1349. I ventured down today, half mad with craving for human voices. I kept a cloth soaked in vinegar pressed to my face and did not dare enter any house. I walked the main road through the village. Not a single living person came out to greet me. I did see bodies, some inside homes through open doorways, some in yards. It seems after a while there was no one left to bury the dead. The strangest thing, in the yard of the Hensons I found a circle of candles still burning, though it was broad daylight. Inside the circle was a rosary and a sprig of rosemary. I did not touch any of it. Witchcraft or prayer? Hard to tell these days. I called out, "Hello, anyone?" and the sound startled a flock of crows feasting on something in the field. No answer came save the echo of my own cracking voice. I fear truly I am alone. I dragged 3 bodies, the Miller family, into a pit they had half dug in their garden and covered them as best I could with earth. The effort drained me and I suddenly felt ill. Panic overcame me that perhaps I'd caught the pestilence after all. I nearly collapsed. But thanks be to God, it was only exhaustion and fright. I splashed my face with well water and hurried back to my loft sanctuary by nightfall. July 3rd, 1349. Odd occurrences. Last night I thought I heard footsteps outside the barn. slow, heavy, as of someone unsure of their strength. I doused my candle and peered through a crack in the wall. The moon was bright, and I swear I saw a shape moving among the trees by the path. Could one other person have survived like me? I dared not call out. If it was a traveller, why did they not call? If it was a neighbour, why skulk? They vanished into the woods. This is not the first night I have heard sounds. 2 nights ago I awoke to what I thought was the faint echo of singing, a plaintive lullaby or chant, coming from the direction of the village below. It went on for a minute or two, then stopped abruptly. I was too frightened to investigate in the dark. It might have been the wind playing tricks, or my loneliness conjuring hallucinations. By day, I find myself listening constantly for any sign of life. Sometimes I talk to the lone hen that miraculously is still clucking around. It escaped its coop. "We are survivors, you and I say to her. She looks at me with beady eyes searching for feed. July 7th, 1349. Today I found Father Julian's journal in the rectory when I went looking for more candles. First, I shouldn't have gone in, as his corpse was still there, but I needed wax and holy water. The journal was open on his desk as if waiting to be read, the last entry in his shaking hand. The pestilence took them all. I buried 32 souls in one day. Lord, if it be thy will, take me next, but spare a few to keep thy light alive in this place. Reading it, I wept fully for the first time since this nightmare began. My tears fell on the page, smudging the ink. Could it be that I am the answer to his prayer? The one spared? If so, for what? I feel a heavy responsibility. If I survive, I must remember. I must tell what happened here, so it will not be forgotten. That may be why I yet live, to be a witness. July 10th, 1349. The nights bring strange comfort now. I have taken to lighting a small lantern and walking at dusk to a high hill overlooking the village. I sit under the oak tree where as children we used to play. From there I can see the roofs of the cottages and the steeple of the chapel. The village looks peaceful, as if everyone simply went indoors for the night. But I know beneath those roofs lies only silence and decay. Still, at that hour, with fireflies dancing in the fields and the sky a deep blue, I imagine I see smoke rising from 1 or 2 chimneys, though I know it's only mist, and hear faint laughter, though I know it's only an echo in my mind. Last evening I thought I saw figures moving down by the river, a little procession perhaps. It was near the old ferry crossing. 5 or 6 shapes, and one seemed to carry a lantern. They passed behind the tree line and were gone. I cannot trust my eyes fully. There are moments I wonder if I have died, and this is some purgatory of phantoms. July 15th, 1349. A storm today, fierce and black. I sat in the loft listening to the thunder. In a sudden deluge I heard what I imagined to be voices, many voices crying out. I opened the door and stepped into the rain, calling, "I am here! Here!" Lightning flashed and I saw no one, only wind and driving rain. But in that thunder I swear it was like the combined anguish of the village roared for a moment. When it passed I was on my knees in the mud, alone again and soaked, not even an echo remaining. I fear for my wits. July 20th, 1349. The pestilence has finally burned itself out here, it seems. No new dead because no one is left to die. I feel healthy, if haunted. Tomorrow I have decided to do a brave, perhaps foolish thing. I will ring the church bell one last time. I will ring it for the dead, all of them. I think if I do not, no one ever will. And the thought of that bell never ringing again, after centuries of our little community using it for weddings, funerals and feast days, it breaks my heart. It must toll at least once for the souls of this village. Let the hills hear it, and know that someone remembers. If I do not write again, it is because I will leave this place. After the bell, I plan to gather what I can and walk eastward until I find living people. I must return to life, or I will join the ghosts here. July 21st, 1349. The writing is shaky. I rang the bell. At dawn, I went down to the chapel. The door was open, which I do not recall leaving so, and inside I found something extraordinary. The altar candles were lit, all 4 of them, fully aglow, though I had not yet struck a flame. A fresh bouquet of wildflowers lay on the altar, tied with a strand of rosary beads. I stood in awe and not a little fear. I called out, "Who is here?" No answer, only the flicker of the candles. I looked around, half expecting Father Julian, alive and well, but only silence. I'm not sure what to think. A kind soul who still lives? An angel? Or the spirits of those departed making their presence known? I felt no dread, surprisingly. A calmness came over me. I whispered a prayer for each family, each name I could recall. Then I climbed the bell tower. I pulled the rope and the bell began to swing. Its voice rang out strong and clear over the valley, a sound our hills haven't heard in many weeks. As I rang it, emotion overtook me. First, sobbed freely, tolling and tolling, each peal a goodbye. To my astonishment, as the bell's echo faded, I thought I heard, just on the edge of hearing, a chorus of soft voices, as if an unseen congregation murmured Amen. When I descended, the candles were still lit, but the flowers and rosary were gone, vanished. In their place, on the altar, lay a white feather, a quill from Father's desk, a bird's plume carried by a draught. It felt like a sign, perhaps a symbol of peace, or a message that my bell ringing was received. I leave this journal hidden in the church crypt, wrapped in oilcloth. Maybe someday it will be found, and the world will know of us. As for me, I take my solitude and my survival onward. I go now to seek the living. May God's mercy shine on this empty place and all the souls that once animated it. Tommaso, sole survivor of St. Lucia's village, year of our Lord 1349. As we finish reading the faded entries, we reflect. Did Tommaso truly witness candles lit by spectral hands, or hear ghostly voices, or was his mind frayed by grief and loneliness? Could a benevolent presence have tended that altar? Perhaps Father Julian in spirit, answering the young man's bravery with a gentle sign. The isolated survivor's journal leaves us with ambiguity. It is grounded in the utterly real experience of a survivor. We know historically some did survive alone, and many wrote of profound sorrow. The subtle supernatural touches, candles lighting, phantom figures at the river, the feather, can be interpreted in many ways. Maybe they were real, or maybe, as Tommaso himself wonders, this was a kind of purgatory of the mind where imagination and reality blurred. One cannot read such a journal without feeling the weight of what it means to be the last human in a place once full of life. In a very true sense, survivors of the Black Death often felt like they were moving through a land of ghosts. Whole communities gone, memories everywhere, but no voices except one's own. It is only natural that, in such conditions, the veil between life and death would seem thin, whether in truth or illusion. This concludes the third paranormal encounter, one that quietly mixes the factual daily struggle of a plague survivor with the eerie suggestion that maybe he was not as alone as he thought, or that the souls of his community gave him a gentle farewell. As we step back from these personal tales, it's time to reflect on what we've heard and consider what might truly lie behind these stories. Reflection and theories. We have wandered through the devastated streets of history and peered into its shadows. Now, in the calm of reflection, let us gather our thoughts. The accounts we explored both documented and legendary, paint a portrait of the Black Death that is rich, tragic, and tinged with mystery. How much of these eerie elements could be true, and what do they tell us about the people who lived through those dark times? Firstly, consider the emotional reality. The survivors and witnesses of the plague were under unimaginable stress. Grief, fear, and exhaustion can play tricks on the senses. A lonely traveller in an empty village might genuinely see an old woman in the moonlight, but that could have been a deer or a drifting cloak caught on a fence, transformed by the mind into a phantom figure in that heightened state of awareness. The brain, when starved of normal human contact like Tommaso's was, or overwhelmed by trauma, can create voices, music and apparitions to fill the void. Modern psychology recognises phenomena like grief hallucinations, where bereaved people briefly see or hear their lost loved ones. It's not hard to imagine a plague survivor stumbling through silent ruins, hearing the echoes of past laughter or footsteps that are not really there, or perhaps were there just recently, but now belong only to ghosts in memory. From a rational standpoint, many ghostly legends of the plague have plausible explanations. The cursed village story, for instance, could have arisen simply because travellers indeed found abandoned villages with evidence of hasty rituals like candles and herbs and no survivors. It's easy in hindsight for storytellers to add a ghostly guardian to such a place to make sense of the eerie emptiness. The plague doctor's ghost might have been originally a real person in costume, perhaps a well-meaning soul who donned his late father's old plague doctor outfit during a smaller outbreak or a masquerade, accidentally sparking rumours. Or later, during times of fear, someone might dress that way as a morbid prank. History has examples of people exploiting fear of the supernatural. As for the journal, it reads as authentic in feeling. But even if every word was true to the writer's experience, we can interpret the supernatural events as the interplay of his hope, faith, and despair. Now, from a historical perspective, it's notable how these supernatural tales often carry symbolic truths. The ghost village's old woman could symbolise the unresolved grief of a community, the maternal figure mourning eternally. The plague doctor ghost symbolises the lingering presence of death in cities that cannot forget what happened, or perhaps the conscience of those places, the part that still seeks to heal the past. The isolated survivor's visions by the altar might represent a final blessing, or the comfort of faith manifesting visually to him. In medieval times, people deeply believed in signs from God and the saints. An inexplicably lit candle in a church would likely be seen as a miracle, not a ghost in the way we think of them now. If someone heard a church bell ring with no living person to ring it, which by the way could happen due to a gust of wind moving the rope, or even birds alighting on it, they might take it as a spiritual sign that the dead were being honoured by heaven itself. The line between paranormal and religious interpretation was very thin in those days. What one might call a ghost, another might call an angel or a demon. The plague maiden from folklore, for instance, could be viewed as a folkloric personification of disease. Not exactly a ghost, but a supernatural entity born from the need to explain why plague moves the way it does, sparing one village but not another. Scandinavian tales of Pista, a crone with a broom, or the figure of death walking town to town with a cart, a common motif in art, were not literal sightings, but they were ways people imagined the plague in narrative form. The supernatural was a language to articulate experiences too vast and harrowing for ordinary words. We should also reflect on how the Black Death spawned a kind of cultural haunting that persisted for generations. Art and literature soon after were obsessed with death. The Danse Macabre, Dance of Death. Paintings showed skeletons merrily leading the rich and poor alike to the grave, a macabre reminder that death unites all. In those paintings, death is almost playful. a constant companion, a metaphor, yes, but perhaps inspired by how ubiquitous loss was during plague years. People also told stories of plague saints who intervened. One popular legend was of Saint Roch, who was said to miraculously heal plague victims and whose spirit was invoked to ward off the disease. If someone survived against all odds, their neighbours might attribute it to a guardian spirit or a bargain with supernatural forces. Conversely, entire villages like our Eam example, though historically heroic, could in lore be painted as cursed places, where, it was said in whispers, perhaps the devil danced on the rooftops claiming souls. Humans are natural storytellers, and when faced with something as invisible and indifferent as a bacterium unknown to them, they crafted stories that had intention and morality behind them, curses, punishments, tests of faith. Let's turn to modern theories for a moment. We now know the Black Death was caused by Yersinia pestis, a bacterium likely transmitted by fleas carried on rats and other rodents. This fact, established by science in the late 19th century and confirmed by DNA evidence from old graves, provides a straightforward explanation for the spread of the plague. We know, in hindsight, that there were no witches cursing villages, no literal Grim Reaper stalking the alleys. The devastation was due to a microscopic organism and the social conditions of the time. Urban crowding, malnutrition, poor sanitation, and ignorance of contagion processes. So, from a strictly scientific view, the portal that plague opened was not to the spirit world, but to a new biological equilibrium. After each wave, the disease eventually died down due to lack of hosts or changes in climate, or the development of partial immunity in populations. But even with this knowledge, the sense of mystery remains when we contemplate the Black Death. Why did some individuals survive when everyone around them died? Was it pure luck, genetic resistance, or something else? Science might say immunity or lower exposure, but to a survivor like Tommaso, it would feel like divine providence or a dark miracle. Why did the plague seem to move erratically, devastating one town but leaving another relatively untouched? Nowadays we might investigate the patterns of trade and immunity, but back then it easily felt like the hand of fate, sparing one place while smiting another. Thus theories emerged. Maybe certain lands had offended God more, or maybe a protective saint watched over this village, or perhaps a curse had been placed on that one. Some modern researchers even explore if collective trauma can imprint on locations, the idea behind so-called residual hauntings. The plague might be seen as a large-scale trauma leaving an echo. While this enters the realm of parapsychology rather than mainstream science, it's interesting as a metaphor. Places like plague cemeteries or quarantined islands like Poveglia in Italy or the plague pits of London carry a heavy atmosphere. People today still report an eerie feeling when visiting them, knowing so much death occurred there. Is it supernatural, or just the power of suggestion and empathy with the past? Perhaps just knowing the history conjures an emotional response that can feel like a presence. The rational mind may conclude. Ghost stories are our way of remembering. They keep the emotional truth alive when the factual memory might fade. The story of the plague doctor's ghost, for example, ensures that Dr. Voss, and by extension, all those who help the sick, are not forgotten. He literally keeps walking in our minds. The tale of the cursed village personifies the tragedy of entire communities lost, giving them one remaining soul so they are not entirely erased. The isolated survivors' visions by candlelight speak to the idea that courage and faith can conjure hope, be it real or imagined, in the darkest hours. Yet, even as we analyse, the mystery lingers, and perhaps that is how it should be. The Black Death was a time of unknowables. Medieval people lived with the unseen constantly, whether it was angels, demons, or the microscopic killers they could never perceive. In their world, the veil between natural and supernatural was thinner by default. Today we have more concrete answers, but there is still something about that period that fascinates and unsettles us. It feels like looking into a twilight realm where half the things moving were invisible to them, and in a way, still to us when we try to put ourselves in their shoes. As an omniscient narrator with the privilege of hindsight, I can see both sides, the scientific reality and the psychological spiritual truth. Both coexist. So in reflection, I would say, the eerie tales are true, not necessarily in a literal sense, but as expressions of what the plague meant to those who endured it. Fear can summon phantoms more dreadful than any bacterium. Compassion can feel like a tangible presence, guiding one's hand. The boundary between life and death can blur when death is everywhere, making it easy to believe one hears the whispers of the departed. If one were to theorize supernaturally, some might argue that mass death on such a scale could indeed thin the veil, as often posited in lore. So many souls departing in a short time, perhaps some linger confused. This is a common theme in ghost lore, sudden widespread tragedy leading to hauntings. Is there any truth to that? It lies beyond what we can prove. But one might note that Europe's fascination with ghosts did surge after the Black Death. It's in medieval post-plague literature and even court records that ghosts and spectres became more frequently reported. Cause or effect? Hard to say. Another angle is to see the plague as a portal in time. The world after it was markedly different. If you were a person in 1352 who had lived through it, you might feel as if you had stepped through some otherworldly gate into a new reality. One in 1352, which half your acquaintances were gone, in which social order might be upended, in which your outlook on religion and life's pleasures had transformed. Many survivors did adopt a more carpe diem attitude. Some historians say the roots of Renaissance humanism and a flourish of art and literature came from the Black Death survivors' changed worldview. Others became more devout, or sometimes more extreme in piety or hedonism. It was indeed a portal on a societal level. The medieval world died and the seeds of the modern world were born in its place. We should acknowledge how resilient humanity is. After all the ghosts and graves, people continued to live, to love, and to rebuild. They remembered the plague in stories and memorials. Some cities erected plague columns or chapels that still stand, inscribed with dates and thanks to God or saints for deliverance. These are physical testaments to that time, almost as if trying to contain the memory in stone so it will not roam free as a spectre. Finally, it's worthwhile to ponder why such a story as we've told tonight is appealing or soothing in a way, even as it is scary. It might be because it frames horror in a narrative that we can walk through safely, guided by history and resolved by reflection. In hearing of those dark times and even the ghosts that possibly linger, we are really hearing about human endurance. We face the fear of death vicariously and see that, yes, it was unimaginably hard, but it passed, and there were lessons and changes after. It's a reminder that even the worst nightmares can come to an end and something follows. Maybe a better understanding, maybe just survival. As we prepare for our conclusion, keep these reflections in your mind. The Black Death remains both a documented reality and a repository of human fears and hopes. Both aspects are true. The villagers died, and perhaps a part of them lives on in stories. The doctor fell, and perhaps he stands guard in collective memory. The survivor was alone, and perhaps he was spiritually accompanied by those he lost. History and mystery entwine. Conclusion: the plague as a portal. We've travelled through an era of pestilence with our eyes open, seeing both the plain truth and the shadows it casts. Now, gently, we close the book of this dark chronicle and consider, what lies beyond the portal of the plague? The Black Death was, in many ways, a portal, a threshold between an old world and a new one. On the other side of its horrors, Europe emerged altered. The immediate aftermath saw labour shortages that gave peasants more bargaining power, weakening the chains of serfdom. Lands lay untilled, villages abandoned, but those who remained found opportunities to rebuild differently. It's said that the scarcity of artisans and workers led to innovations, a sort of early industrial ingenuity, and to the flourishing of guilds. The weight of the church's influence shifted as people grappled with why such a catastrophe had happened. Some lost faith, others found it more deeply. Mysticism grew, so did skepticism. In some places, persecution, like those against supposed plague spreaders, gave way after the fact to regret and more inclusive edicts, as societies realised that fear had driven them to cruelty. The medieval world's frame of reference cracked, letting in new light, and sadly, sometimes new darkness too. In a broader sense, the plague was a portal in the human story that forced a confrontation with mortality on an unprecedented scale. Those who went through it were, to use a modern term, forever changed. Just as an individual near-death experience can alter a person's outlook, this collective brush with extinction altered civilization. Some historians mark the Black Death as the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of early modern Europe. After so much death, life was never valued quite the same. For some it became cheaper. Witness the dance of death imagery, the morbid humour in art. For others it became dearer. Witness the humanitarian impulses, hospitals and charity that grew in subsequent centuries. It's like humanity passed through a crucible. Now, consider the supernatural portal. The title of our conclusion, The Plague as a Portal, hints not only at a historical turning point, but at a metaphysical one. Many at the time literally saw the plague as a doorway to the apocalypse. In their minds, the end of days had come, and perhaps the gates of hell or heaven were open to receive multitudes. While the world did not end, for countless individuals it felt like stepping from one realm into another, crossing from life into death, quickly, unexpectedly. Those dramatic circumstances fed into folklore that plague times were moments when the line between this world and the next grew thin. Ghost stories, the presence of death personified, last messages from the dying delivered in dreams. All these are themes that blossomed around the 1350s onward. In this narrative sense, the plague was a portal for spirits too, a massive departure of souls that, in legends, might not have all gone peacefully or might have left some essence behind. Yet, portals swing two ways. If death flooded out through the portal, perhaps insight flooded in. The plague forced questions. Why do such things happen? What causes disease? How can we prepare or prevent? In the centuries that followed, those questions slowly led to answers, to the development of medicine, of public health, of the scientific method to investigate cause and effect rather than accept supernatural explanations by default. So in a way, the plague opened a portal to knowledge, though it took time to traverse. It would be another 300 years before microscopes would reveal the microbial world, but the journey began in the wake of the Black Death, when people saw the need to rationalise and record better. Now, as our sleep story draws to a close, imagine dawn breaking after a very long night. Our omniscient narrator stands at the threshold of a plague-ravaged village, but beyond it, the sun is rising on new green shoots in the fields. There is a hush. The ghosts, if they were there, have gently receded with the darkness. What remains is the memory, and memory is the true portal through which we've travelled tonight, a portal through time. By remembering the Black Death, by telling its stories, both factual and phantom, we honour those who suffered and learned from it. We allow their world to inform ours. In doing so, we may even find that the portal connects not just past to present, but the living to the dead in a compassionate pact. We remember you. We learned from your pain. You live on in our stories. For the listener drifting to sleep, there is comfort in this. The tale was dark, yes, but it was guided by a thoughtful voice and lit by the small lamps of human kindness found even in plague times. Think of the courage of Ayam's villagers, the dedication of the plague doctor, the resilience of the lone survivor who rang the bell. These are lights that shine through the portal of history, telling us that even in humanity's darkest chapters, there were those who kept the flame of decency and hope alive. In the grand scheme, the plague ended. The darkness passed. And what came after, though different, was life continuing. If there are spirits lingering from those times, be they literal or figurative, perhaps they are not malevolent haunts, but simply echoes longing to be heard. And by hearing them tonight, we may have given them a bit of rest. The old woman of the cursed village can sleep knowing someone remembered her vigil. The plague doctor's shadow can fade, his duty done, as people now appreciate his real counterpart's sacrifices. The lonely survivor's words have at last reached ears, absolving his solitude. In the soft cadence of a bedtime story, we have navigated fear and come to a gentle close. Let us conclude with an image to carry into dreams. Picture a heavy wooden door, the door of a medieval city gate perhaps, or the door of a crypt. On one side of it is darkness, with the murmurs of plague-struck towns. On the other side is golden morning light, with birds singing and a world renewed. The door opens, that was the plague, a passage from one state to another. Now the door swings shut quietly and latches. The night has given way to day. The portal served its purpose and now stands as a silent monument to what transpired. Our journey ends here, at the threshold, in a hush of understanding. The age of pestilence, with all its horrors, has spoken to us through the veil of time. We step forward, carrying its lessons and its lingering mysteries, and as with all portals crossed, we emerge a little bit changed, a little more appreciative of the delicate line between life and death, and the resilience of the human spirit. Now, take a deep breath, and let these images settle. In the quiet that follows, allow yourself to let go of the fear, holding on to the knowledge that even the darkest night eventually yields to dawn. The plague was a portal, and we, safely on the other side, can close our eyes in gratitude and perhaps a touch of awe at the journey we've recounted. Sleep now, knowing that the tales of yesteryear guard your rest, and that from great darkness, light and wisdom have a way of blooming anew. Good night.